The Black Archive.
The Black Archive. Good evening and welcome. My name is Frank Callahan. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere most soldiers spent the rest of their lives trying to forget. Not a battlefield, not a charge across open ground, not the roar of tanks or the sound of aircraft overhead. No, tonight, we're going underground, into the tunnels beneath, into a place where Marines said the war did not end when the shooting stopped, a place where voices continued long after the men speaking should have been dead. You're listening to the Black Archive, a place dedicated not only to history, but to the shadows history leaves behind. Because there are parts of war that official reports rarely describe properly. Parts too strange, too personal, too uncomfortable to fit neatly inside military records or history books. Moments soldiers whispered about years later in quiet bars, hospital rooms, veterans' halls, or sometimes not at all. And if there's one thing I've learned after studying enough war stories, it's this. The most frightening things soldiers experience are not always enemy weapons. Sometimes, it's the silence after the battle, the places left behind, the feeling that something unfinished is still waiting there. Now, if you know anything about Okinawa, then you already understand why that island affected men differently. By 1945, the Pacific War had become something brutal beyond description. Entire islands were being fought over inch by inch. No retreat, no surrender. No clear line between soldier and civilian anymore. And Okinawa was the worst of it. More than 180,000 American troops landed there during the spring of 1945. They expected resistance. Of course, they expected caves, bunkers, artillery. But what they found was something far more disturbing. The Japanese Imperial Army had transformed the island into an underground fortress. Beneath the hills and ridges existed miles of tunnels carved directly into the limestone, hidden hospitals, ammunition depots, command centers buried beneath the earth itself. The battlefield wasn't on Okinawa. The battlefield was inside Okinawa. And for the Marines sent into those tunnels, war became something claustrophobic, personal, almost unreal. You have to imagine it properly. No sunlight, no wind, no sense of direction. Only darkness, wet stone, the smell of burned flesh, and the knowledge that somewhere ahead, someone might still be waiting with a rifle. Or worse, maybe nobody was waiting at all. That's the part veterans struggled to explain afterward, because many Marines who fought on Okinawa described hearing things underground they could never fully understand. Voices, footsteps, metal scraping against rock. Sometimes they heard Japanese conversations deep inside tunnels already sealed shut by explosives days earlier. Other times they reported movement beneath the ground long after entire cave systems had supposedly been cleared. Now, officially, military historians will tell you there are logical explanations for this. And to be fair, many of those explanations make sense. Sound behaves strangely underground. Limestone caves carry echoes over enormous distances. A single drop of water can sound like footsteps in total darkness. Combat fatigue, exhaustion, lack of sleep, trauma, all of these affect perception, especially during prolonged combat. And Okinawa pushed men beyond human limits. But here's the thing about war. Even when logic explains something, fear doesn't always disappear. Because fear isn't rational. Fear is emotional. It's the feeling. A man gets standing underground at 2 in the morning, hearing boots echo somewhere ahead, knowing there shouldn't be anyone left alive down there. That's what happened to a Marine patrol near Kazu, Ridge in April of 1945 that their mission was simple. Inspect a tunnel system after flamethrower teams sealed the entrances hours earlier. Officially, every Japanese soldier inside was presumed dead, but perimeter guards began reporting sounds beneath the ground, not random noises, organized movement, rhythmic metallic sounds, and voices, low Japanese voices, speaking beneath tons of collapsed rock. At first, officers assumed trapped survivors were trying to escape, so they reopened part of the entrance. And that's when things became strange. The Marines entered expecting wounded enemy soldiers. Instead, they found tunnels filled mostly with corpses, burned bodies, collapsed chambers, destroyed equipment, but deeper underground. The sounds continued. Clang dot, clang dot, clang dot, metal striking stone somewhere ahead in darkness. Now, I want you to stop for a second and really think about the psychological state of those men. People today hear stories like this and immediately jump to ghosts or supernatural explanations. But the truth is more complicated than that. War already places soldiers in an almost unreal mental state. Sleep deprivation changes perception. Constant danger changes perception. Isolation changes perception. Isolation combat, that changes everything, because human beings are not built to spend hours inside dark tunnels listening for movement they cannot see, especially not after weeks of watching friends die around them. Many veterans later described Okinawa as the moment they stopped feeling entirely human themselves. The island stripped people down emotionally until survival became instinct more than thought. And under those conditions, fear becomes something physical. You feel it in your breathing, in your heartbeat, in the silence between sounds. One Marine later described the caves as feeling alive. Not haunted, alive, as though the island itself resisted the men entering it. And honestly, maybe that's the best way to understand Okinawa. Not as a normal battlefield, but as a place where suffering became so concentrated that it changed the atmosphere around it. Because, remember, tens of thousands died there. American soldiers, Japanese soldiers, civilians, entire families, trapped between armies. Many buried alive inside caves by artillery collapses or flamethrower attacks. That kind of death leaves something behind psychologically, even if it's only memory. The patrol eventually reached a chamber underground, where they found a radio still transmitting static despite having no power source attached. Now again, there are possible explanations. Damaged equipment, residual electrical current, misidentified sounds. But in the moment, standing underground, surrounded by bodies and darkness, explanations don't matter as much as emotion. What matters is what the men felt. And according to later accounts, what they felt was terror. Not combat fear, not the fear of being shot. Something older than that. The fear of entering a place where reality itself feels uncertain. One detail from the account always stayed with me. The footprints, bare human footprints crossing wet, clay underground, fresh, clear, but leading nowhere. The tracks reportedly emerged from solid rock and stopped in the middle of the chamber. Now, logically, there are explanations for that too. Water patterns, distorted impressions, confusion in darkness. But I've noticed something over the years studying war stories. Soldiers rarely remember events exactly as they happened physically. They remember them emotionally. And emotionally, those Marines remembered feeling like they were no longer alone underground. That feeling stayed with them longer than the battle itself. You see, war doesn't end cleanly for the people who survive it. That's something movies often get wrong. There's no clear line where fear simply stops, no magical moment where the mind returns to normal. Especially after places like Okinawa. Many veterans carried those tunnels home with them for decades. Nightmares. Claustrophobia. The sound of dripping water triggering panic years later. Some never spoke about the Pacific at all after returning home. Others talked constantly because silence felt worse. And that's another reason this podcast exists. Not to sensationalize war. Not to turn suffering into entertainment, but to preserve these moments honestly. Even the strange ones, especially the strange ones. Because sometimes, the strangest stories reveal the most human truths. Fear. Isolation. Exhaustion. The desperate need to make sense of something too overwhelming to fully understand. That's what these stories are really about. Not ghosts, not monsters, people. Young men pushed beyond emotional limits inside environments no human being was ever meant to experience. And maybe that's why the Okinawa tunnel stories continue surviving all these years later. Because deep down, they capture something larger than one battle. They capture the psychological cost of war itself. The way extreme violence lingers in places and in people. Even after history moves on. To this day, parts of Okinawa's underground tunnel systems remain sealed. Some collapsed naturally, others intentionally. Archaeologists and military historians still occasionally discover hidden chambers beneath the island, and local residents continue telling stories about hearing sounds near old cave systems during heavy rainstorms. Now, whether those stories are supernatural or not, honestly misses the point. Because the important thing is this: the fear was real, the suffering was real, and the men who walked into those tunnels carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. That matters. History isn't only strategy maps and casualty numbers. Sometimes, history is a Marine standing underground with a flashlight in his shaking hands, hearing something move in the darkness ahead, and realizing no amount of training prepared him for what war actually felt like. That's the part people forget. Wars are not experienced historically while they happen, they're experienced emotionally. One frightened moment at a time. And down beneath Okinawa, in the darkness under that island, some men discovered fears they never completely escaped. This has been Frank Callahan, and you've been listening to The Black Archive. Good night.